Yes, I will get straight on that. Yes. So, cool.
Where are you going to be studying?
I've already lost my water. Sorry.
Okay, everyone, thank you for your patience. Sorry we're starting a little bit late. So this is Pascoe Sabido.
Sound a bit quiet.
Who is hello everyone, this is Pascoe Sabido, so a researcher and a campaigner, and he's been working across the not-for-profit space in various NGOs for 10 plus years now. So he's going to just share some of his experience and kind of a view of the landscape, and I think this is sort of going to be a bit of an interactive session as well, so do feel free to ask questions, and I'll hand over to Pascoe. Thank you very much.
So thank you. Yeah, I'm Pascoe. And I guess I was going to try and split it into three parts. First of all, looking at corporate power, then looking at how to fight it, and finally sort of alternatives. I have to completely admit, this is, let's see, I'm going to try and keep my presentations to a minimum. I make it quite interactive with people, make sure this is not just a 3-hour monologue. We'll do my best, but it's slightly, I'll be honest, this is not, I work for an organisation called Corporate Observatory, and we look at lobbying in the EU. We look at corporate lobbying, so which is one element of corporate power, but this is not, my normal presentation I'd ever give, so which is why I've been trying to cobble it together this morning. So it's basically going to be a series of pictures, which I'll do some talking over and ask people a few questions around. Maybe just before I kick off and give some background, I just wanted to get everyone's name. So I know Sam. Andrew. Jana. Igor. Julian. Bianca. James. Evie. Cool. Okay. And because I had no idea, A, how many people there'd be, B, what sort of level. So it sounds like it's quite European. So you probably have a better idea of Europe than the British people in the room. But yeah, I don't know how much experience people have of corporate power, so I'm going to try and keep it at, I guess, a relatively basic level. Can I just quickly, I'm going to point across all of you and you're going to give me maybe what you studied or your interest.
Geography and business.
Okay.
Accounting, economics.
Sustainability management.
Music.
Politics. Civil engineering.
Financial crime.
French.
Okay, so very broad as well. That doesn't narrow it down, but it sounds like quite a high level. So maybe I don't have to be basic at all, which means maybe it could be even better to have more of a conversation. But yeah, to give the background, so CEO, we are based in Brussels, about 14 people, and I guess we've been spending the last 20 years trying to expose corporate lobbying at the EU level, because it's this hotbed of corporate lobbying where many lobbyists come to try and influence EU regulation. But me in particular, I work on climate change, which is, I guess, is the link. I guess me and Sam have been working on things for many years ago together, and we've been in the same worlds due to the sort of climate links. But I in particular look at energy, and specifically gas at the moment, so the gas lobby. But I will make sure, I'm going to try and keep it quite broad, but I think quite a few of my examples will come from there. Let's see. So the first topic is corporate power. Oh, this is the wrong, there we are. Corporate power, okay. Now I've lost this. So in terms of corporate power, I guess, I put this up here being slightly provocative. There's this image that corporations rule the world. This is what you hear from many NGOs, conspiracy theorists, left-wing politicians. Corporations rule the world. So I thought I'd put this up here and see what we can get from this map. I mean, first of all, who agrees? It's quite a broad, perhaps slightly extreme statement. Corporations rule the world. Does anyone agree? Yeah, a little bit, maybe. It's nuanced. Of course, everything's nuanced. I'm being a bit provocative. But who are the corporations here? Because I think when we talk about corporations ruling the world, it's important to know where we're coming from. So can anyone name the corporations here? Any you see, do you recognise that? This is not the biggest screen in the world, I apologise, Sam. But can anyone just name any of the corporations there?
BMW.
Coca-Cola. Like, exactly, we missed Nescafe, Disney. Yeah, Intel. This is General Electric up here. This is Mercedes here. We've got Pepsi. And can anyone see what they've all got in common? We've just named them.
You're multinational.
They're all multinationals. I'm going to slightly give it away. This is a bit of an old map, but all of them, bar Samsung, come from the US, the EU, and Japan. If we talk about corporate power, I mean, this is quite a few years old. This is really what we're talking about. We're talking about the old Western world, which was at the forefront of globalization. Globalization is, I guess, the core of corporate power. Corporations, by their very nature, the multinational corporations, by their very nature, spread across multiple countries, and that's been due to the dominance of certain countries in the world. So corporate power has traditionally been a Western or global northern phenomena, rather than a sort of global one. And to put it into perspective, I guess, this is from October 2018. This is Global Justice Now's, it's a press release from them. And just when we're talking about corporate power, do corporations, multinational corporations run the world? 69 of the richest 100, so basically 70% of the world's biggest economies are in fact not countries. This is, I think, up from 60% maybe in 2006, 40% this is something that's happened in the last decade, or decades for sure, to see what's happening here. This is massive. So when we're talking about corporations ruling the world, it's really, they are far bigger than many, many countries, which is incredibly relevant in terms of power relations. But it's slightly changed now from the map we had. Does anyone know who today are the biggest corporations in the world? No. Anyone else? Apple is one of them. Apple's actually number 10.
Microsoft.
Amazon's not. This is based on revenue of last year. Disney's not there, so the ones I've got.
Google, Unilever.
No, see, these are massive, massive corporations.
Oil, if it's partly state-owned.
It still counts, yeah.
Gazprom?
Gazprom's not there. Sinopec is there, though, which is the Chinese oil and gas corporation.
This is by revenue.
It's by revenue last year. No, does anyone know number one? It's quite relevant for your project. It's Walmart, in fact. It's the biggest corporation in the world. Shell is number, at least count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Number 7 is Shell. But amazingly, so number 1 is Walmart. Walmart is the 24th biggest economy in the world. So it's bigger than Belgium, and this is one corporation. Second, so this is where some of the change comes in from the map I showed you. Actually, I'll tell you what, I'll give you the list. Is State Grid from China, Sinopec Group from China, and China Natural Petroleum. So we can see, in fact, what used to be a very Europe... Oh, I forgot to put you... Oh, we've gone into something else. But what used to be a very European, North American and Japanese monopoly has now spread. 3 of the biggest top 4 are Chinese. But you could... Yeah. Cool. So, but you can see the rest of them are still European, US, Japanese. But what else have these companies, what does this say? What have these companies got in common? Or what's this say compared to perhaps the map we saw just now?
Quite fossil fuel heavy.
A lot of oil and gas companies. Yeah. There's quite a few car companies. I'm amazed Volkswagen is still there despite Dieselgate. I mean, it's held on. And for me, what it says is it pays to pollute. I mean, these are some of the dirtiest companies around, from the big oil and gas majors to big energy companies like State Grid to one of the biggest, I guess, buyers of industrial agriculture, car companies, etc. It pays to pollute. So I guess this is all very relevant for your project in terms of who's dominating these markets at the moment. And these companies are very, very rich at the moment, and they don't really want to get any less rich. I think it's quite important to point out that their goal is to stay rich. And if their business model is based on exploitation of resources, particularly natural resources, then primarily ones that trash the environment, they're not going to be wanting to move away from this. So, what have I got next? So I tried to just get a bunch of cartoons. So basically these companies, I would say, in fact, they rule the world. I mean, perhaps not individually, but when we put their power together, they are incredibly powerful, a huge amount of power. But I was going to ask, maybe this is a little bit basic, but where does their power come from? Where do people think that corporations' power comes from?
Their money.
So their money can buy them quite a lot, for sure.
Well, I think it's mainly political influence.
Political influence.
Which comes from money.
Comes from money, but also what have they got to offer? I mean, this is also the interesting thing. Why, if I could be the UK, or I could be Mali, what am I being offered by these corporations? Jobs. This is actually one of the key ones. So jobs.
They also offer like products that people really need, or think they need, like cars and those kind of things.
So they'd get you to buy what your population wants. Investment is a big thing that's promised. And taxes. I mean, unfortunately, they're promised as well. That if you invite this company in, it has technology, it will invest in your country, it will develop it. This is what's told anyway, and it will pay taxes, and you can spend that on healthcare and education and other things. So it's quite interesting that this is what, of course, they promise. But in terms of, do we know what they actually use their money to do?
Pay dividends? Yeah.
Pay dividends, exactly. So this is maximising profit. I mean, they've got an obligation to their shareholders to maximise profit. And how would you maximise profit? I mean, if to have enough money to pay your dividends, or big enough dividends, shall we say, what sort of practices would they engage in to ensure they can have enough money to pay dividends? Cheap labour, so push down wages.
Avoiding taxes.
Avoid taxes, massively.
Advertise.
They can advertise to...
They can, create a brand for themselves and effectively
grow
lie
their market,
about what
yeah.
about what they're doing.
They can greenwash their terrible activities.
Sometimes in some cases engage in illegal activities like bribery, for example.
Yeah, it can get you contracts. It's been pretty effective. Eni and Shell at the moment are being prosecuted in Italy and the Netherlands for what they did in Nigeria in terms of bribery to win contracts. Externalities just don't pay for it. Yeah, massively. So externalizing negative externalities. And these, I was going to say the key one, it sort of touched on a lot, but it's pushing down regulations. I mean, making sure that countries cannot have high environmental, social, economic regulations, because do you know, what can they threaten? I think you brought it up before. Who said jobs?
Yeah, they can say, well, we'll go to another country that doesn't have the regulation.
So a lot of this is in fact blackmail. But it's interesting, when I seeing this image, it's about often exploiting countries in the global south. But in fact, working in Brussels, these are the same arguments. Every time you have, we want to have new climate change regulation, we want more renewables, and industry says, no, it's going to damage our business model, electricity is going to be too expensive, we're going to have to leave. And that fear of losing jobs is the biggest pull for any politician. So they have a huge political power by threatening job losses and a lack of investment and a lack of innovation. And they do so, they play countries off against each other, which I think is a really key thing to do. And as you said, they'll go next door if you don't give them what they want. So it's really relevant for fighting climate change and trying to have regulation around this. Because, what we saw, so research came out a few months ago from Influence Map, who looks at lobbying. And the 5 biggest oil and gas companies in the world, so we've got BP, Shell, Exxon, Chevron and Total, they spent $1 billion since the Paris Agreement was signed, so since the UN climate talks were signed, $1 billion spent on lobbying and PR against the goals of the Paris Agreement. So whilst publicly they're spending a fair few million on saying how much we care about climate change. They spent $1 billion together since the Paris Agreement was signed against it. And it's interesting, they suppress wages, but not their top wages. I mean, Shell CEO Ben Van Buren earned more than 20 million euros last year. So they're definitely not affecting their own wages. And what we're seeing instead in the UK in particular with energy corporations, we're pushing up energy bills. Executive wages, executive remuneration is going up, and so are energy bills. So the sort of, it's being quite unfairly spread. And then the thing we heard, dodging taxes, I just wanted to get a bit of, there's been some great work by, has anyone heard of the Transnational Institute? TNI. So they are a big network of researchers, academics. They're based in Amsterdam, but the network's across the world. And every year they do a great report called The State of Power. And this year they did one with this amazing website that was just full of infographics. I've stolen quite a few of them, but it's worth checking out. And they have a lot of information on how global power works, how corporate power works. And this is one, they're sort of looking into how much is siphoned off into tax havens. So between 21 and 32 trillion is estimated to be stashed offshore. So rather than being put in a bank account in that country where you'd pay tax on it, or declaring it's part of your profit, you put it offshore so it doesn't get seen by the tax man. And the global tax losses amount to 500 billion every year.
Sorry, what was the name of that organisation?
Transnational Institute, or TNI. And the 500 billion would pay for 35% of the money needed to end extreme poverty, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, access to clean energy for 3 billion people, which is currently what we don't have, universal access to clean water, and still have enough to build some massive solar plants and tackle major infectious diseases. So this is the money that should be coming into tax coffers, but is not, because it's going to shareholder dividends, because they're maximising profit through dubious measures, shall we say. But, I think we can talk about how the corporations operate, in countries where they do oil drilling, mining, etc. I don't know if people have visited what often are in fact called sacrifice zones. So where there is a mining project or a drilling site, the local population sacrificed, the environment sacrificed, their livelihoods, local farmers, fishermen gone. What happens to, even now in the US, we're seeing through fracking and mining, that in fact these sacrifice zones are not just in the global south, they're also in the US, and you see a huge impact on women in particular, through rape, through sexual violence, and particularly in the US it's been against indigenous women. And so there's currently campaigns to try and visibilize indigenous women and what they're going through and what they're currently putting up with. So these are very real impacts that happen wherever we have this sort of quite violent extractivist economies that often go with some of these biggest companies we've seen here.
Did you say in the US, or you mean in the continent?
No, in the United
America?
States.
Oh, okay.
So Northern America, where you have, be it fracking or coal mining, often and some oil pipelines, etc. Often in the zones, there's been big campaigns to try and show how many indigenous women have been disappeared, or have been found raped or killed in these zones. And it's seen across the world where you have these zones of natural resource extraction. And the other thing that often goes with it that we don't see so much of or hear so much of, but it's quite obvious, is the militarization. These sacrifice zones are highly militarized because if people resist, the army is brought in to stop that resistance. I was in Colombia, a big coal mine in Colombia, and you've got military everywhere, and people are getting killed the whole time. You've got the paramilitaries, you've got the actual military, and they've got a national policy of increasing extraction, increasing coal mining, oil drilling, etc., gold mining, and people in those zones who get in the way are seen as collateral. So it's worth just saying all of this happens with impunity. This is, I think, for me, quite an important word, that governments are so fearful from loss of investment, loss of GDP and growth, loss of jobs, that they allow corporations to get away with this. There's partly that, and there's no legal mechanism to hold corporations to account. If corporations like Walmart is bigger than Belgium, the money it has to fight court cases is huge. And especially in countries in the global south, sub-Saharan Africa, even fighting a court case against a corporation like this is going to cost you millions and millions, and that comes out of your health budget. So in fact, we've seen huge amounts of impunity and no legal mechanisms to hold them to account. What time are we doing? Okay, but I was going to say corporate power is not just built and maintained by corporations. It's built and maintained by governments. And I think this goes back to sort of our first slide of the map, that in fact rich countries, traditionally the US, the EU and Japan, and now we're seeing expand to China, use their foreign policy and international diplomacy to support their corporations. I mean, originally, British Petroleum was a state company. A lot of these companies, before the big wave of liberalizations in the 80s, were state companies. Foreign policy and that corporation's interests were one and the same. But I don't know if people have any examples of countries using diplomacy or foreign policy to further the interests of their corporations.
America.
And specifically, just in general, the entire
Trump's
foreign policy.
America.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, you mean like a specific example? Well, I to be honest, I don't know. I can't think of specific. Well, American coal, I suppose.
Can you
The trade war that he's starting to protect various different American industries. So.
Yeah.
I was gonna.
Maybe Qatar is quite a good example. They're using a lot of their economic clout to have political say that's disproportionate to their size and influence. I think they're even just their soft power projection. Buying like Paris Saint-Germain and then sponsoring it with their tourist board and having outlandish contracts that are just disproportionate to the size of actual sponsorship deals that normally go into football. I mean, for a country of about 300,000 people, have quite a lot of clout in the Middle East and wider areas.
Definitely. So oil has always been used. I mean, in the Middle East, oil's been used as a bargaining chip, but also oil's been attracted quite a lot of foreign policy from those who want the oil as well. Any other, from which country? I heard there's an Italian, where's? English. Okay, I heard the way you said your name. Any UK examples?
Maybe arms companies in the UK. BAE, massive company.
Massively. And do you know who was sort of the ambassador or who was doing the arms deals? So Prince William was the trade envoy and was involved in sort of Saudi arms deals. This is using our royal family of the UK to go and push the interests of an arms company. Theresa May last year went on a trade mission to Africa. This just happens all the time, that our governments go and promote the interests. I was going to say the other example, that this sort of close relationship comes also from having corporations in government, which is quite common. I don't know if people remember Rex Tillerson, who was Exxon's CEO, went straight to be Secretary of State under Trump. He's now gone. But one of the reasons, I don't know if people know why he wanted to be in there. So Exxon had a huge contract with Putin for gas in northern Russia. And then the sanctions came in and they couldn't extract their gas. So one of his goals was to go in and try and smooth things over and remove the sanctions with Russia. It didn't work, he ended up leaving. But I think this, it's part of getting quite close. I've got a few other examples, but I'll leave them. Does anyone have other revolving door examples? So going from a multinational corporation or going from industry to government?
Well, people who run banks go into the regulators all the time, and that's just a constant revolving door. Goldman Sachs and the Treasury Department. Hank Paulson, who was the head of the Treasury in the financial crisis, was the head of Goldman Sachs before. Alan Greenspan, and actually I don't know about Alan Greenspan, but there's they're all mixed up. Like the regulators are all waiting to get back into the private sector.
Get some money.
Crazy.
And does anyone know who's heading Goldman Sachs International at the moment? Who's the chairman? So he used to be the president of the European Commission for 8 years. Barroso.
Oh, really?
Went after his cooling down period, went into Goldman Sachs, and people got so pissed off in Brussels, even the staff set up their own petition calling for him to have his pension removed because it was so embarrassing for them that they've got this guy now in Goldman Sachs. But he...
Sorry, they have a nickname for it, Government Sachs.
Government
they
Sachs.
call it. Yeah.
Is there anything, like from a legal point of view, is there anything wrong with that? Like, is he entitled to do that?
So the rules, unfortunately, the rules are not very good. There's an 18-month cooling off period where you're not supposed to go into lobbying roles. But in the meantime, he'd already taken up being the chair of the board of the Bilderberg group. Bilderberg group?
Bilderberg, yeah.
Bilderberg, yeah. He'd taken up various board positions, but it got referred to an ad hoc ethics committee, which is made up of the commission themselves anyway. So it's made up of non-independent staff. So it shouldn't really, it's not ethically correct, but legally it's allowed.
There's like a lot of proposals now in Western countries, especially the US, which is quite good in my opinion. And is that basically, because if you look at how much congressmen are paid, for example, they're actually paid, well, compared to an average person, they're paid quite good. But if you look at, for example, they need to have 2 offices, one in their home constituency and one in DC, and they don't get to write it off as a working expense. And so at the end of the day, like, their pay is not that high for what they have to spend. And so there's proposals to increase their pay, and in return, they'll be banned from lobbying,
And like public speaking.
basically for like 20 years after, or like something like that, or like
Sounds great.
and so that's that's like a proposal, but also looks bad because you're increasing the pay of
this is the problem.
of congressmen. So, but I think it's gonna eventually happen because it's you gain society gains much more for politicians having a ban on lobbying. Then it loses with a slight pay increase.
Yeah, completely. I mean, this is the Democrats when they came back to Congress. I always confuse Congress and Senate. Warren is a senator, isn't she? Yeah, so it'd be the Senate, I think. So when the first bill that was put down by the Democrats was a really strong bill against lobbying. So it's become, I think in the public eye at least, this idea that this is, in fact, the EU, so this is the Directorate General for Trade and Business Europe, which is the biggest corporate lobby group in Brussels, who are basically in bed with each other when it comes to making trade policy. They see confidential documents that we as an organisation have tried to see and we're not allowed to see. We end up taking them to court over it and lost. But this is, one of the key ways. And so this close relationship has come under huge public scrutiny, and I think we've got to a point where people are actually saying, like, enough's enough.
Why did the organisation lose the court battle?
Because it was claimed that it's a bit of a long story, shall I tell you afterwards? Yeah. It's nitty-gritty as always. So this is Revolving Door. Maybe just another one to mention. Is anyone German here? German links? So ex-German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder now lobbies for the Russian gas pipeline Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2. It's quite cushy. But it happens at all levels. I mean, like Barroso, etc., is the high level, but this happens at every single level. And it's a key way of ensuring that governments are aligned with corporate interests. Yeah. So
I'm just wondering what your opinion is about countries that are not maybe in the Western mainstream, like Russia or China, for example, when they have for example, Nord Stream, when there's a pipeline, do you think there's a bigger loss because of the environmental damage, perhaps, like just oil can do, or like one pipeline could do? Or do you think that because of these pipelines, Europe is less reliant on American corporations, and so like individual corporations might have less power to like threaten, for example, the EU or something? So do you think, are you like completely opposed to Nord Stream and these kind of projects, or do you think there's also like a value that Europe will be less dependent on big corporations?
I mean, all of these pipelines are built and operated by big corporations.
Yes, but for example, if will be some influence from one corporation and some influence from the other corporation, then certainly the EU has more independence to reject a corporation and enforce regulation than if it's like entirely dependent on like a few corporations, and those have so much power and influence.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the big EU's energy policy is around gas at the moment. How do we move away from Russia? Russia accounts for more than 40% of EU gas imports. So building Nord Stream 2 increases reliance on Russia. But in fact, rather than thinking how do we get more gas or diversify gas, we need to move away from gas. Like, we need to move away from fossil fuels full stop. Building another pipeline coming from Azerbaijan, that bastion of human rights. We're moving from one dictator abuses human rights to another. I mean, most countries where there's oil, due to the influence of post-colonial legacy, is pretty shit human rights, environmental standards, etc. For me, I think we need to not build these pipelines now because we've got a very small window in which to tackle climate change. And I was going to get onto gas a bit later, but I can do it just quickly now. Gas, in fact, is as bad for the climate than coal. I don't know if people often think gas is a bridge. Gas is a bridge fuel. It's going to get us to renewables. It's much better than coal. This is what industry says, because when gas is burnt, it's around 50% less CO2 than coal when it's burnt. But what you forget is, do people know what gas is made of?
Methane.
Methane. Basically, 97% methane. Does anyone know the impact of methane as a greenhouse gas?
It's much more.
Anyone who came yesterday will know.
Yeah, really? Good.
Dragon.
20 times powerful, more powerful.
No,
80
Over
times.
100 years.
yeah, it really depends what time scale.
100.
So over 100, if you're looking at a 10-year time period, it normally lives in the atmosphere around 12 years. But over 10 years, it's more than 100 times worse. So, and huge amounts leaks from these pipelines. It leaks from when we're extracting and drilling. It leaks from when the LNG ships, the liquefied natural gas ships, come across. So there's huge problems that what we're doing by building these pipelines is locking ourselves into another 40, 50 years of gas, which is what industry wants. But it's not, it's not achieving anything on climate terms, and it's not achieving anything on its own terms either. It's amazing. So this big pipeline from Azerbaijan called the Southern Gas Corridor. Azerbaijanis do not have enough gas. So it's either going to be empty, not have enough in it. B, they might have to go to Turkmenistan or Iran even, which is not very likely. Or C, which is looking more likely, is Russia's building Turkstream, which is going to connect to it in Turkey and fill it full of Russian gas anyway. So this whole idea of diversifying is a load of bollocks. But there's a lot of, who's behind this, not Nord Stream 2, the Southern Gas Corridor? It's BP. It's SOCAR, the Azerbaijani big oil and gas company. It's the big Italian, Spanish, Belgian, Swiss pipeline builders and operators. So these are big business interests involved, and no one's talking about moving away from them. So I disagree that building new pipelines is going to get us away from dependence on a few corporations. In fact, that's what we built, loads of liquefied natural gas terminals. Does anyone know what LNG is? So you get gas, which is a gas, and to make it into a liquid, you have to go to minus 200 and something degrees, and you have to basically, freeze it, and you have to cool it to a liquid state. It takes huge amounts of energy, and that allows you to ship it. So you've got these ships that go across the oceans from Qatar, Australia, and at the moment, our biggest importer of gas on LNG comes from Russia. So Russia is now not just our biggest pipeline, but also our biggest LNG supplier. So I think it's all a load of rubbish. And we need to move away from fossil fuels.
Why is it easier to transport it? Is it because it
takes up far less space? Right. Yeah. It would make no sense having a boat full of gasified gas.
Is it still as flammable in that state, or
there's a huge?
Is that also part of it?
No. What the dangerous bit is actually when it's a liquid. If it gets even a few centigrade hotter, it begins to boil. Because it tries to become a gas state again, and then that's incredibly flammable. So in fact, when the boats travel, they have to let off they have to let it evaporate, which is basically putting methane straight into the atmosphere.
When you said that people often think about it as being not very carbon intensive, is that because they're not including the methane in the calculation and they're just focusing on the CO2 part?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and we don't have good enough figures for pipeline leakages or for LNG sort of evaporations. So I realise I've gone on a massive tangent, but unfortunately a lot of the figures come from industry, and particularly in the US there's a huge underreporting, and even the EPA underreported. But some scientists have been taking airplanes and flying across sort of gas fields with infrared, I think they use to see the methane leakages, and have made their own assessments and said it's much, much worse. So if you have like 3% leakage across your network, or from during the whole supply chain, it makes it worse than coal. And that's not very unlikely, particularly around fracking, can be up to 6% leakage. So it's pretty bad. I realise I'm going to maybe skip the next bit. I was going to say, okay, I've got two rather nice chunks, but maybe are there any questions up to now?
I do actually have a question, although maybe you're going to come onto it later, so if that's the case, then obviously feel free to knock it back. But I was going to ask, I mean, let's imagine that we all agreed right now that we should dismantle ExxonMobil. Do we know how that could be done in a way that would sort of not create panic in the market or create sort of effects in the economy that would be very destructive? Because it's so tightly woven into pension funds and everything else and the shareholders. Is there a way to dismantle a company like this? Or is it actually quite easy? Like, what's the situation with that? Has anybody ever done it before? Like, dismantle a big company like this?
I think we're going to get onto solutions as sort of how to fight it, and I'll touch on it again because I think there's the economic side, there's the social license and other things. But no, it's definitely not simple.
Right.
And it takes quite a hands-on approach from the state. And what do you do with workers? I mean, there's all sorts of questions locked into this.
It happened with Standard Oil, though, right? In about 1912, the big Standard Oil.
Who became Exxon, didn't it?
Yeah, well, it came Exxon and Chevron and several other companies, but it was like the American oil monopoly. Rockefeller, that was his company. And then there was Teddy Roosevelt brought in massive antitrust legislation, which still stands today, and they're thinking about using it for Amazon and Facebook and Google, the FANG companies. But there is legislation to tackle antitrust, which is what you're talking about. So when there's insufficient competition.
It's just like, I mean, if we came up with a regulation overnight that said, we're going to stop extracting fossil fuels out of the ground, it would just have so many, I really hope we can do that, but it would have so many implications. Like, even if we said in 50 years we're going to stop doing it, or if we put a date on it, like the value of assets starts to go down, people's share prices start to go down, it has knock-on implications. It's so crazy, isn't it? But I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert.
No, we should definitely come back to it, because I think there's lots of steps we can take towards getting there. And the big question will always, who pays? Will it be the workers? Will it be the sort of the pension funds? Or will it be BlackRock? Or, there's always these big questions around who pays and who takes the risk and who takes responsibility. Because at the moment, the government takes a lot of the risk and therefore the cost, but doesn't actually reap the benefits. But we know these companies are too big to fail. We see it from regulators as well, who were terrified of this.
So I completely agree that we need to move away from fossil fuels right now. I definitely wasn't saying that we should build more pipelines to diversify. I just mean that if we we have to move away from oil, but we should do it equally from all suppliers, from all countries, not just one other. But my question is, what would you suppose we do with existing pipelines that were recently built?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question kind of how to decommission them. Who pays for it? It's interesting, so you've got these big European networks of gas companies who look at pipelines, and then you've got the electricity ones. And the electricity ones say, well, let's use your gas pipelines for electricity wires and other things. There's things you can use them for, but the question is always, who pays for them? And instead, I was going to get it to it at the end, is instead we're basically proposing to keep using gas by something called, I don't know if anyone's heard of renewable gas. This is the future. This is the new thing that's happening in Brussels. The industry's behind it. It's going big in France. National Grid here in the UK is behind it. We're going to create gas from renewable electricity, supposedly. Excess renewable electricity. And that's going to be fed into our grids. Because you can create hydrogen by taking water and running electricity through it. And you split the molecule between the H and the O, the H2O. And so you create oxygen, you create hydrogen. But what we're really seeing, imagine we want to move our economy towards hydrogen, which is a type of renewable gas, and you can make hydrogen for renewable electricity. That sounds quite cool. Who owns it for a start? How much can we actually produce? By 2050, it's going to be this much. It's going to be tiny because we haven't got the technology, the learning curves, etc. It's not going to be anywhere near ready. But what industries realise is if we talk about hydrogen and everyone says, oh, renewable gas, does anyone know where most hydrogen comes from today?
From natural gas.
Hello. Yeah, fossil fuels. So I think it's about 50% natural gas, 46% oil, and maybe a bit of that's coal as well. But basically we get it from fossil fuels. So natural gas is CH4, so you split the C, get yourself loads of carbon, goes into the atmosphere, and the H you can turn into hydrogen, mainly for industrial processes. But the UK is now going big on hydrogen, doing a whole citywide experiment in Leeds, and it plans to get it from natural gas. This is the big thing, and then capture the CO2. So we'll magically capture all the pollution from carbon and put it underground. Something that's not been tested or proven, but this is what the UK is going for. And yeah, I mean, Statoil, or it's now called Equinor, but the Norwegian oil and gas company is really happy because they're providing loads of gas. So yeah, anyway, this is what we're planning to do with gas pipelines. We're planning to just carry on using them and claim that we're just going to decarbonize the gas system at the moment. Increase methane massively. So I think this is the fossil fuel industry part, but I just wanted to quickly touch on, for the sort of corporate part, so in this, does anyone know, so we're talking about governments paving the way, shall we say, for many of these corporations and corporate interest. Does anyone know so they create an international framework, like new laws, new treaties, new frameworks, new architecture that allows corporations to expand their markets and other things. Does anyone know what these international treaties are?
Free trade agreements.
Free trade agreements. Any others? Does anyone do international relations or international political economy?
Yeah.
Yeah. If anyone did international political economy, what are the international treaties created to help corporations go and make more money? I'm simplifying it here. Yeah. So we've got the trade deals are really important, but also it's worth mentioning, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, the IMF and the World Bank also did a whole slew of what's called debt restructuring. And they restructured economies of countries, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and some South Asian countries, claiming that you've got your debt's too big and we're going to only help you pay back your debt if you liberalize your economies. And this was the big push of globalization in the sort of 80s, late 70s and 80s, which is really important. But today, we've got trade deals. So does anyone know what are the trade deals? So we've got NAFTA, TPP. Do you want to explain what it is?
The Trade Pacific Partnership. I'm not entirely.
But just the acronym is fine. Just yeah.
Yeah, I just know that the United States pulled out of it recently when Trump was elected.
So we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
There are plenty of countries in Southeast Asia and North and South America that agree to it. So you have South American countries, you have Australia, and then all the Asian countries.
Exactly. So this was a bit of an Obama era thing. Does anyone know? So that was in the Pacific, and the US also went towards across the Atlantic. Does anyone know what the US-EU free trade deal was called?
Trans-Pacific? No, TTIP.
TTIP.
Well, I can't remember the acronym. What does it mean? Partnership.
The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Yeah. And there was also, does anyone know the one with Canada? CETA, exactly. So the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. So these are sort of treaties signed or tried to be negotiated. CETA has now been signed. TTIP got defeated. But do they know what these trade deals do? How do these trade deals help corporations?
The standardized legislation, standards, protections, wages, they harmonise things. They harmonise the framework in which they operate in order for them to be able to move services, capital, people, or to place what they need in which is the most harmonious environment for them to operate in.
So we've got like regulatory harmonization, which often means a race to the bottom. So we're going to bring down your regulations so that when the US was negotiating with the EU, we wanted to stop all the sort of GM regulations in the EU, food safety, chemicals regulations, get rid of them to make it easier for US companies to operate over here. The very simple one is tariffs, removing tariffs at the border. So if I'm trying to protect my local renewable energy company, my solar panel provider, whatever it is, if I sign trade deals, it means actually I'm not able to protect my local companies against, especially from a country with a very small, emerging industry, to protect it against the big boys. This is the big thing. So you bring down tariffs and you allow goods to flow in from other countries.
Because I know that there are many bad examples of trade deals, but I'm just wondering whether you support or oppose trade deals in principle, because I'm sure you'll agree they can be good. For example, the EU itself, obviously there's free trade within the EU, and so I'm sure it could help Eastern European countries, for example, develop.
So it's interesting. My view, I was working in Brussels for 5 years. I still work based in Brussels, and the EU as a project does what other free trade deals do. It's very much in line with the interests of the organizations, the companies who are big enough to take advantage, who have economies of scale. So I can, the classic example, I can, as a milk company, I can get my milk off the farmers here because it's cheapest. I can transport it over there to turn it into yogurt because it's cheapest. I can use things across Europe. But ultimately, if you're a small company, you can't take advantage of the economies of scale that these companies do. And instead, what you see is goods and services from whichever company can have their prices the lowest, coming and crushing your local economy. It's partly what happened to Greece. Germany was able to keep producing goods at a very low cost because it had a deal between trade unions and the state, and so trade unions and the industry and the state in terms of keeping wages down. So it carried on exporting reasonably high-tech goods around Europe. It's amazing the document when Spain, is anyone here Spanish? No, when Spain joined the EU, in the memorandum it said, you're going to have to accept that for the first few years or the first period, your parts of your economy will crumble, basically, because they're going to not be able to compete with other European countries, which are far more adept at producing goods for a lower price. But it says, don't worry, because it will be replaced in time with other industries. So instead we had tourism, we had a housing bubble. Spain's economy has turned into a consumer economy. The same happened with Eastern Europe, turned into a consumer economy to try and service those economies in Western Europe. And what we're seeing now is a rise of populism. We're seeing a rise of authoritarian right-wing populism attacking the EU that actually is still quite linked to the corporate class. In Eastern Europe, in Hungary and places, and Czech Republic, you've got sort of in power, who own corporations who are pretty linked into sort of the European and even global markets, but are using a rhetoric against the EU and its opening of the economy. Now, I have to say, I think free trade in general is an oxymoron. It's never free. The rules are being laid down by governments, and the rules are in the favour of certain actors and not others. But I think before I got there, but the organisation I work for wrote a book when it got founded, sort of in the late 90s, and called Europe Inc. And it's definitely worth looking up what was the driving force behind the expansion to Eastern Europe. A lot of it from Western Europe was industry lobby groups in Brussels needing new markets because they needed to expand. And so this was part of it, was having consumers to buy their cars, having cheaper labour. But what's it done? Who's it benefited? I don't think, from what I see now and being in the UK and the antipathy and the hatred towards migrants, particularly Polish for a while, it's not been all it's done is it's suppressed wages across Europe. It's not been done in a constructive way. You could say perhaps if it was done better and you have much better regulations and you could discriminate, maybe, but I think free markets as a rule will always end up benefiting those who are the strongest, because it's, you know, if everyone was started the same, maybe, but I think even then you're always going to have hierarchies, you're going to have more power and certain ways to build more, and the moment you have more, you've got an advantage over other people.
So you think that the people in like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, which are relatively like green economies, and their the quality of life is like very high compared to other Eastern European countries, do you think the people in those countries would be worse off without any free trade between each other?
So I think we can distinguish between trade and free trade, because what free trade does, it tries to remove all barriers.
I mean, without the EU, you think there would be?
I mean, I think it's a slightly impossible question, because we're packing everything of the EU together. If the EU was done very differently, I think those countries could be far more egalitarian, far more integrated into the rest of Europe. But I'd say I don't know enough about the Baltic states, rather than more the sort of Central and Eastern European rather than Northeastern European. But I see it as well with the Balkans. I mean, the impact it's having, the inequality that's happening, the consumer states that are being created, the sort of erosion of local economies. No, I think we have to be very aware of the economic impact of the EU, whilst it's been trying to push a social Europe. But social Europe is very difficult to achieve whilst you're undermining it with economic liberalism. I think economic liberalism is a really difficult thing to control through social policies, and for me it's why we've seen a collapse of the social democratic parties across Europe, because they've all gone for economic liberalism and said, oh no, but we'll be nice and we'll still try and redistribute, and they've not been able to. But anyway, we're getting into other topics.
Could you maybe give us your thoughts very briefly on the common agricultural policy while we're talking about the EU? Is that, in your eyes, is that kind of a black and white, it's bad, it's good, or is there any benefits to it, or there's a lot going on there, right?
So it's been renegotiated at the moment. So this is the thing. What can be put into it? How can these policies be changed? Common agriculture policy is the EU's big pot of money that goes to farmers. That was really pioneered by the French because their farming was very strong. The UK, at the moment, while still in the EU, gains quite a lot from it. But there's a big question of who gets the money. And we've seen it goes to the richest. I mean, it goes to Prince fucking Charles in the UK. He's the biggest recipient because he's got the duchy. Yeah, I think it's this shows my middle classness. I was in Waitrose a few months ago and looking to buy tomatoes, and they only had the duchy brand. And I said, I don't want to buy. I said to the staff member, I don't want to buy these because I'm giving my money to Prince Charles. I said, oh no, we bought it off him. So I don't know if it's still him completely or if they split it or how it works. But he was one of the biggest recipients, him and the Queen.
Just because it seems to me like on the one hand, they're subsidizing farmers, which perhaps if we're saying that we need to sometimes help our local economies compete with global markets and preserve kind of a more normal kind of economic variety of businesses, right? And then maybe there is a place to subsidize farmers, but then it leads to lots of crazy situations with like mountains of butter, right? And like food being dumped on the third world at like dirt cheap prices. Yeah. So I mean, I don't know, like, do you think there's a place for subsidizing farmers?
I think that there's no homogenous farmer, as in we need to break it down and look at who are the farmers. There's some very destructive industrial agricultural practices which are being supported. But like when I was in Brussels, we were working with milk farmers to try and stop TTIP, in fact, because they realized this was the end of them. Like, these are small-scale farmers who every pint of milk, they were in Brussels, in fact, throwing milk on politicians because every pint of milk they produced, they were losing money. And so we've got to a stage where CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, should be helping small-scale farmers. It should be promoting a much more integrated form of agriculture, agroecology. How do you protect landscapes? You know, how do you protect local rural economies and communities? But instead, a lot of it goes to the biggest farms who have already swallowed up all your farmers. Especially in the UK, we've had such a concentration of farms and sort of farm holdings. It's very impressive. But elsewhere in Europe, you've definitely got far more agroecology, far more local organic farmers doing really interesting things. And I think we should definitely be supporting them. But we need to break down and see it's not just the farmers, because in Brussels and in the UK, I mean, the industrial farming lobby is one of the most powerful and dangerous ones out there. That they're looking for huge industrialization. And that's not if we're talking about climate change, it's just not feasible. And it's all going to be mechanized, huge animal welfare issues, huge pollution issues, huge climate issues. It's not a model we should be supporting. But if we're going to have the power to be able to really shape the common agricultural policy, that's something I doubt. I think it's good to try, and it could be used in a great way, and I don't think we should throw it away at all. But we should really be asking what we use it for, and really be questioning what, for example, Michael Gove says when he talks about reforming it, because I think there's slightly different intentions in there. Yeah. So anyway, I was going to talk about free trade, but like TTIP, etc. Last thing on free trade. Has anyone heard of ISDS? No. So this is like a
court system.
Exactly. This is like a private tribunal court system where explain it.
So it elevates corporate structures to the level of a state, or like it basically gives them the ability to sue states when perceived breaches of competitive practice are identified. So if a state overly regulates a given sector, then it provides a recourse for a corporation to be able to sue the state essentially and claim damages and revoke legislation. And it's basically a meta court, and I don't think it's subject to the same kind of legal parameters that we would have in a common law.
No.
It's lots of private evidence, and it's very secretive, but it has power over national governments.
Has anyone heard of this court system? It's called the Investor to State Dispute Settlement, and it sits at the sort of ICIIS something, the sort of International Chamber of something investment dispute settlements, a sort of private UN sort of level body.
Is that so? It's a kind of supranational body that. So what is the jurisdiction dependent on if you've signed a trade agreement?
That's part of the part of the trade agreement. It's the recourse to justice if there are perceived breaches by parties who've signed it.
And what about the other way? Can states sue corporations, or is it only on one way?
No, it's one way.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. So this is, but just to give a few more slightly outlandish details. Does anyone know who the judges are?
Are they corporate CEOs?
They are the same corporate law firms that represent the corporations. So what you've got is you'll have, because it's arbitration rather than a court case, it will often happen in someone's office, and you can choose as a corporation, you choose your lawyer. They're paid up to $1,000 an hour. If you're a country, you get to choose a lawyer, and then I think you both agree more or less on who the third person is. But that third person will come from the same pool of lawyers. So imagine if you're a lawyer and you're now today a judge, you're a little bit worried that if you find against, let's say, Philip Morris Tobacco, the tobacco company, that tomorrow Philip Morris won't be choosing you and your firm for its court cases. So you've got an incentive to actually find in their favor. I mean, there's a huge conflict of interest there. Yeah, and these things are completely one way. So corporations can sue countries. Countries can't sue corporations. And even if you lose minimum 5 million, the minimum cost of a court case is 5 million that government has to pay. So if you're a government and a corporation comes along and says, we don't like this new regulation, we're going to sue you, you have to think, have I got the money? Because I think it's worth saying, what's the bit before? The reason you get sued, so it's actually based on, it says the investment chapter of free trade deals. And in this investment chapter, it originally came about in the 50s. Like, I think 1952 was the first sort of inclusion of it, because they were really worried about appropriation or renationalization. Imagine you've made a trade deal or investment deal with a dodgy dictator, and there's a popular uprising and he gets overthrown, and they say, oh God, look what he's done with the economy, let's take this back in, or let's change regulations, etc. This allows a corporation to say, you can't renationalize the company that we got given. So this is what it's originally for. It's now interpreted as meaning appropriation. Oh, what's the word? It's not appropriation, where you... Expropriation, there we are. Expropriation, not of physical property, but in fact of profit. So these private tribunals, oh, there it goes. Okay, so I'll just quickly finish up ISDS to give the specifics of it. So this investor-to-state dispute settlement, it basically protects an investor, i.e. a corporation, a foreign investor, so foreign corporations, projected future profits. So that's what that's what they claim is expropriated. So let's give a very concrete example. In Quebec, there's a huge popular referendum and a big social movement that said we don't want fracking. Managed to get local law saying no fracking. Fracking was banned, and Lone Pine, a fracking company, I think it had its office in the US, said, well, under NAFTA, that means you're going to expropriate our future profits, and we're going to sue you for $750 million. I don't think they won. I'm not sure what the status of that exact case is right now, but maybe a very well-known one is, have people heard of Keystone XL Pipeline in the US? So it's going to bring tar sands from Canada down to the US. Big campaign against it for years and years and years. Finally, Obama says, no, we're not going to build this pipeline. And Keystone XL, the company behind Keystone XL, called TransCanada, says, well, we've already invested money and we were projected to get loads of money, so we're going to sue you for $15 billion. So imagine the pressure that puts on a country. What we've seen with the case of in Germany, Vattenfall, which is a big Swedish energy company, I think is now pulling out of coal, but it used to have coal mines, lignite mines in Germany, as well as power plants. It has a coal-fired power station in Hamburg, and the local authorities of Hamburg had to improve their water quality to meet EU water directive measures. So they said to Vattenfall, you need to reduce the amount of water the Vattenfall put back into the river. They said, you need to sort this out. And Vattenfall said, well, if you make us sort out our pollution, our water pollution, that's going to cost us money. And so that means we're going to get less money than projected. So we're going to sue you for the difference, for all the money we lost. And this is the city of Hamburg. This is not even Germany, the state government. It's the city of Hamburg, the municipality of Hamburg. And so Hamburg said, well, we've not got the money to pay you, so don't worry about it, carry on polluting the water. And this is what happens. It leads to local governments, national governments saying, just carry on fucking everything up, doing what you're doing, and we will pay the cost because we can't fight you. So it literally leads to an impunity on behalf of these corporations, and stops us moving away from damaging practices to the ones we'd like to see. So particularly in climate change, what does it mean? It means moving away from fossil fuels is incredibly difficult. It's going to be really difficult because actually corporations have this tool, I even call it a toolbox, as there's more than one tool in it, that allows them to stop us moving away from fossil fuels. Or anything, or nuclear. So Germany is pulling out of nuclear. Same Vattenfall has sued it for a couple of billion. I can't remember the exact figure. So this goes back to your point. If we decide to disband Exxon, who would pay for it? Exxon would have these sorts of treaties to say, well, actually, this government here, we projected to have X amount of profit. So with the infrastructure and the architecture we have here, that means it's pretty likely there's going to be us, the public, who pays, which is why it's really important we do dismantle this architecture.
And who decides how much profit they're going to take? The big accounting companies?
Deloitte, and yeah. I mean, your law firm, how do you pull this figure out? It's just, So unfortunately, I mean, what we've seen in like small countries like Togo in Western Africa, they got threatened by Philip Morris when they tried to put plain packaging cigarettes. And they said, okay, don't worry about it, it's fine. We'll just keep your packaging and your logo and everything. So it particularly affects the poorest and the weakest in terms of in the global system. I was just going to say the last one I wanted to touch on before skipping lots. So this is sort of corporate America, but I want to ask people, you know, a key way that corporations keep their power is through cultural hegemony. What do people think that means? What would that mean?
They're embedded in the zeitgeist with their logos, and their image, their identity is sort of wound up with cultural identity of individuals, you know, preference. Advertising is a big part of that. And I suppose this idea that they are somehow representative of a value system, or
we have a tendency as people to kind of want to go along with the crowd, so these shared assumptions that we have about how much money we need and what it is to live a good life and what we should be striving for, this kind of thing, which in this case is you should earn as much money as you possibly can, and you know, the ultimate goal is to become rich and have a big house and own lots of shares and stuff. Like these are the cultural kind of ideas that are helping to
the Randian dream.
Yeah. Atlas shrugged. Exactly. So this soft power that comes in rather than just the hard power. There's the hard power and the military that backs it up, etc. But there's also the soft power that everyone wants. The corporations, they want that lifestyle they're selling. And I guess the biggest cultural narrative is the American dream. I was going to ask those who've said less, what comes to mind when I say the American dream?
Well, for some, the American dream is for some people like to migrate to US because they have better life, because they're not having the same type of things in their country, the rights, the liberty, the freedom, security, so they feel safe when they think about like the American dream. The thing is that when they start doing it, it's so difficult and so impossible, because it's impossible to struggle and to buy those corporates. You're so mesmerized with the branding and just by being a consumer that you don't realize about what actually matters.
Yeah, massively. So this.
Forget, and you're just buying and buying and buying, and like Andrew was saying, you want the big house and be a millionaire, and then by the time when you realize you can't do that, it's too late.
Yeah, completely. And I think there's exactly like you say, there's what the dream we all see is, and then there's the reality, which is very, very different. Is anyone else, if I say the American dream, what comes to mind?
Create enough wealth so you don't need to work anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Get rich and then retire to a big house or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, finding the social aspects.
Yeah, like this, because the idea I think is important of meritocracy, because behind all of these, so the sort of wealth, being rich, you know, having this as a goal, as a really good thing. It serves two purposes. One is also allows sort of the corporate world to get very, very rich and for people not to question it, because that's what we're all trying to do. And the second is it serves the purpose, if policies or if corporations make people poor, well actually it's not the corporation's fault, it's the poor people's fault for not trying hard enough. This idea that we can all be rich if we want to is really good. And this idea of the meritocracy, you climb that social ladder if you try hard enough, gives an idea that the rules are fair. So you don't really question what it is. I think this freedom one for me is a really important one. Talking about freedom, because that freedom applied to our life and liberty is a really great idea, but it's then being taken to apply to corporations. You know, freedom for corporations, this libertarian ideology, like Randian ideology, that basically allows them to hide behind the Tea Party or public people who want this for their own lives, despite the fact they're probably destroying the environment, the social world of many of these people's lives. So it's a good way for them to hide. And I was going to say, having this nice house, nice car, it's really good at really protecting the idea, or at least propelling the idea of private property. private property is a really good thing and we need to protect it because that's, I mean, we see through trade deals, they really protect intellectual property. You know, I've gone to Bolivia and I've found a flower and now this flower is mine, which is ridiculous. You know, this flower comes from nature. It's been known about for however many millennia by indigenous peoples and the medicinal impacts. But now because we've got a trade system, a big drug company can go to the Bolivian jungle, find a certain flower and claim it is its own property because privatization of property is something that we've been really pushing. So anyway, corporations are using this narrative to push their business models and incorporate it into sort of a lifestyle. And I think you said once people are in it, it's a lot harder to fight against it. And I constantly, if you're on Twitter or whatever, and you insult an oil company and the thing that, or you call out an oil company, the thing that always comes back is, oh, you're tweeting on a phone, what do you think that's made of? And you're constantly accused of hypocrisy. You know, and I am. I mean, I look at me, of course, it's impossible not to be hypocrites. But it's this idea that you have to be pure that I think really harms us. It harms our ability to fight because we all feel guilty. Because we're using the system, we can't fight against the system. And that, for me, is the biggest bullshit, is their biggest trap that they've managed to set.
Better to be a hypocrite than a nihilist, right?
Definitely, yeah. Embrace your contradictions. It's not just about our consumer choices. We're human. We all have huge contradictions in all parts of our life, and we shouldn't be made to feel ashamed of them, but as long as you're aware of them and can own them. But anyway, this is, I think, one of the important things in fighting back, but it makes change very difficult. Okay, I'm going to skip the next bit. The next bit you should definitely look at if I send it round. Not this bit. This was just to say, at the heart, there was a big study done. Can you see there? I'll send it around afterwards. By some academics in Zurich, looked at all the corporations and all the links between corporations, who owned who. And it was very interesting because I think that, for me at least, the thing we've missed, I've not spoken about, is what connects all these corporations. They found at the heart of every corporation, or like the corporate world or ecosystem, are a handful, like 100, 200 companies which link all of them. And in fact, does anyone know what this core is? What sort of companies is it made of?
Accountancy firms?
Close. I mean, financial institutions, for sure, which accountancies come from. So we find that transnational corporations form a giant boat. Well, at least it went that way. Better than last time. Yeah.
I don't think I have the internet anymore.
Sorry, it's still again.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Cool. So they found the transnational corporations form a giant bow tie structure, and that a large portion of control flows to a small, tightly knit core of financial institutions. This core can be seen as an economic super entity that raises new important issues both for researchers and policymakers. So basically, it sounds very conspiratorial, doesn't it? That a small core of financial institutions control the corporate world, which controls, which is bigger than many countries and controls much more than that. And I was just going to run through, this is from T&I's report as well. It's definitely worth looking into. These are the top 13 financial giants, banks, investment funds, all of them too big to fail. So this is in trillions. So, BlackRock has $6.288 trillion worth of assets, of other people's money, but assets that it's invested in.
Sorry, so are you saying that these companies own all of the fossil fuel companies? And is that what you're saying?
Not all of them, but their shareholder. A lot of the shares within the fossil fuel companies will be held by quite a few of these companies.
Right. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no. I'm not saying these specific 13 are the ones that own the fossil fuel companies.
They're not like they don't own a dominant share in them necessarily, but they're
No, but BlackRock does in many. So I was looking at Canada, and in fact, BlackRock owns a massive share in Canadian companies, in some of the Canadian fossil fuel companies. BlackRock owns massive shares in many energy companies because now it's seen as a particularly infrastructure, because it's seen as a decent investment. You get a guaranteed sort of 7% return on your investment, which is becoming harder and harder. So a lot of them are owning large parts of our fossil fuel infrastructure, yeah.
So dumb question, what is BlackRock again?
So BlackRock is an investment fund. It's the world's largest investment fund, which invests using an algorithm and other things on behalf of lots of people. But it's massive. So I'm not going to go through it, but I was just going to say, so this is, I guess, a bit like you're saying, these 20 investment funds own top 20 most influential world investors are significant shareholders in 61% of the world's biggest firms. So if you see this key fact, BlackRock, Vanguard and State Street are the single largest shareholders in 40% of all listed US companies. That's massive.
But sorry, these investment funds, private individuals own shares in the investment funds themselves.
So they'll be managing it on behalf of private individuals, companies, pension funds. So they'll be managing, yeah. But how much transparency? I mean, yeah, they make most of their decisions.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah. But I'm just going to quickly show this because I haven't got time. But you can see again, if we go back to our map, where are the financial centres? It's in the old world. And actually something more than the old world, it's in the old British colonial world. If you look at where they are, you know, we've got, I'd say the exception there is Beijing and Shanghai. But you've got New York, London, Zurich, Frankfurt, Singapore, Hong Kong, you know, Sydney, Tokyo. This is where the big financial powers are. And then maybe it's worth bringing it back even further to the individuals, you know. Out of the basically 200 directors who control 41.1 trillion in wealth, who manage these 17 asset management firms, 70% of them are male and 84% are white European descent. So therefore, who runs the world? Me. Yeah, middle-class white European men. Unfortunately not me, or it will hopefully be a lot better than it is, but you can see how narrow this is. When we talk corporations run the world, you know, who controls the corporations? A lot of these investment funds. Who's in these investment funds? It's a very small part of our population who have all probably gone to the same university with the same studies and have, yeah, come from a very similar background is what we find. Same with lobbyists in Brussels. A lot of it comes from a very small section of our society. Anyway, this was the end of part one, which was supposed to take about an hour less. So part two, this one, in fact, is much more interactive. Did I do anything? Yeah. Oh, well, actually, I wanted to ask, let's go back, a quick question to you. How do you think corporate power and this architecture it upholds, how it affects the project that you're involved in and what you want to do?
It's because, you know, your goal depends at some extent to prohibiting what they're doing. So it's like they control you and you need their support, you know, to just develop what you want to do. It's like, how do you fight them?
Yeah, definitely. Well, oh, hello?
Yeah, if we could win over some of these people, say, then it could hopefully do a lot of good because it's so centralized. But yeah.
Yeah.
And money, obviously.
Yeah.
Technology,
Yeah.
hard to compete with, like starting from grassroots, unless you find investments.
Yeah.
But if, oh, sorry, I keep talking. Other people should introduce. Sorry, I keep saying.
No worries. I mean, I think this was quite a big question just to launch at people and maybe one to reflect on for later, but go.
Yeah, if we can change the zeitgeist and the underlying assumptions that we all live our lives by, then we can chip away at their soft power. And once their soft power is gone, then you know, hopefully changes will arise organically. What I'm wondering about personally is, to what extent are the behaviours of the people in these companies wrong because of incentive structures, and to what extent are they wrong because of their own personal issues as people that we all have, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And in terms of them putting value in the wrong places. So if it's a case of the incentive structures are wrong, then that speaks more to regulations and things like that to me. And if it's more about, actually the real problem is with our own personal struggles as people, maybe if that's the case, then maybe we can get people to change the way they think and act and behave, and that could change everything. So this is what I'm thinking about, basically.
Do we want to say something about maybe how we've thought about, I suppose, combating the hegemony of corporate power?
Please do. That fits perfectly with our next section. So if people are happy to move on, my first question was literally, I was going to write it down, and I was going to take notes from you of what are the ways of fighting corporate power. So I think if you're able to start with your own, that'd be wicked. Thank you. Your own ways of how you've thought about it amongst yourselves.
Well, maybe just to kick it off. So the thing that we've identified as the commonality, the thing that gives the current system its ubiquity and its power is money, and more specifically the financial system. And the structures behind money that define its flows, and the idea of a bottom line. We talked a bit about that at a couple of workshops, I think, but this idea that the profit is always the bottom line is the central fallacy that's at the heart of a lot of all economics, and it's such a pervasive idea that it's not even questioned. But the reality is, and it's a very obvious reality that is very presentable and people are receptive to hearing it, is that there are bottom lines way below profit which are to do with our existence, and profit is meaningless if there's no existence to build it on. There's loads of sub-bottom lines that we should be acknowledging in accounting and in auditing and in how we manage risk and how we think about externalities. And the problem is that we don't have a model, and there's no incentive to get to a model where those real bottom lines are accounted for in decisions. So one of the central premises of this project is to create a parallel system that is almost a model of how we could organise financial flows and how we could, I suppose, transact value and a more equitable way of doing that takes into account these very real bottom lines. And I suppose in terms of fighting corporate power, I think this comes down to how you think about conflict and how you think about the dialectic. So traditionally, the idea was that in the Socratic method you would have a thesis, an antithesis, and some synthesis would come of those two positions that everybody benefited from. But unfortunately, the thesis that we're presented with, so the underlying fundamentals of our economic system, there's no power to question that. We don't even have the language, particularly. We're born into the system, and no one has a choice at any point to question it. So I think providing the opportunity for there to be a questioning of it, and possibly a presentation of an alternative, is a very powerful tool. It also allows you to step outside of this conflict paradigm, because if you're talking about fighting something that is so entrenched, has so much power, has so many stakes in government, in all the things that we consume, in the water we drink, its tentacles are so deep. There's no point facing it head on. Almost, you have to think of more imaginative ways to get around it. And one of the ways to do that is to create a better alternative and almost use the power of the markets, or use your ability to sell that alternative to people as your power base. So without actually confronting it directly and playing by the rules of the current game, create a different game. And if you make that game appealing enough, then you have a very strong narrative
soon as we create a mechanism that we think we've created to recycle the money, so the lifeblood of the current system, into something more sustainable, accountable, transparent, all the rest of it, and you're able to present that clearly, then you have a roadmap out of the current model without actually imposing it altogether. You just create something that's better, and hopefully the appeal of that is what wins you the argument ultimately.
Okay, because the question is also assuming that the current model won't fight back.
Well, this is it. So
yeah.
It can only fight back if you fight it on their terms.
Oh, no.
Well,
No. I mean, I think there's a facade that we pretend that what the market is and what we play by, and then there's, I guess, the real way, the world really works. And if they want to block things and stop you, throwing, I don't know, planning regulations, whatever. I mean, there's all sorts of very annoying, boring, bureaucratic things, and just cutting off supply to money, all sorts of things that can happen. I think it's just I think we should be very aware of what we're up against. I agree, creating alternatives is one of the key ones listed. I'm going to come on to energy democracy at the end with a little video, but I think it's great to be exactly thinking about what the alternatives we can do. But for me, there's sort of a few. So people have, the ones I was thinking about is, do we sort of fight them? How do we shut them down? I don't know. Do people have other ones, before I go through mine, other ways that you would fight corporate power? The ways you've seen corporate power being fought at the moment?
Well, I think in some sense, we shouldn't really think about like too much, like, oh, how are they going to respond or whatever. I think it's quite simple in the sense that there are some regulations that we can just like impose, through elections and through convincing people. So, for example, in the US, it would be limiting how many the donations that corporations can give to politicians, because at the moment corporations can give unlimited donations to politicians. So I mean, America is way worse than Europe in that sense. And then in Europe, you could have other ones like banning lobbying for foreign politicians. And then, I mean, it's gonna be hard to get these through, of course. But I mean, we should just focus on getting those through. And then like the problems that would persist after that is like, people would say like, oh, okay, so we're limiting what companies are doing here in Europe, but then you have those like Russia and China, right, where they'll still be making pipelines in other areas of the world, but then the West still has really strong economies, and they still have relations with their countries based on other things other than fossil fuels, whether it's tech and technology. And then also at one point, sooner or later, it's also just going to become economically beneficial to invest in green energy because of the future. And I think we just have to focus on this and not really worry about the response, because it's going to happen somewhere or another. But there's not really much that will help if we're going to be scared of that.
Okay. Any other sort of examples people have of fighting corporate power that you've seen recently? I'm going to maybe mention a few and see what people think.
There were some kind of outsider candidates in the US, right, who got elected to Democratic seats.
So
like
you got
young people like who were political outsiders. There was a girl who was like a waitress, right?
yeah. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, yeah.
So charismatic.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders might be the nominee or something, but at the end of the day, if it's not and it's someone else, then at least they've done what they could.
If she can win in America, which is possibly one of the most powerful examples of this corporate power, that says something, isn't it?
Definitely. I mean, Bill, you have to. This is what I was going to ask you. So, doing something like this, how do you think she got to where she was?
Mass participation with the Sunrise Movement.
Yeah, exactly. So she had a whole movement behind her that were going in, that were also going to other senators, pushing this agenda, pushing the Green New Deal, cutting the ties. But yeah, it was grassroots mobilizing, community organizing. So it's these things, political power is never given, it's taken. And to win an election, you have to build a political base. And that's the thing. So who do you have to work with? And I think I don't know, does anyone see who else AOC is working with in the US? I mean, from the Green New Deal, Bernie Sanders, I'm thinking more sort of other parts of society of like trade union movement. Yeah, is another really strong one, which means what's it mean actually to work with the trade union movement, which is one of the key. Trade union movement is, you could say, it upholds corporate power because many of its members are within the corporations. At the same time, it has a huge potential to fight corporate power because it's in the workplace, it's there. And if it can come on board, it can do so. But what would it mean to get trade unions on board? I mean, what would you have to think about to get them on board? And this is always the question when we talk about sort of the green politics. What would you have to do to bring them on board?
If what keeps everyone going with the current model is worrying about the future and pensions, etc., you need to offer them something for the future so that they know if they join you, they've got something to work towards.
Completely. So it's like taking other movements' concerns into consideration. So be it pensions, be it that actually at the moment, if we move away from fossil fuels, most people working in the fossil fuel industry, they're chucked on the unemployment job heap. Like, it's that if I was working in trade union, or I was a trade unionist in a fossil fuel industry job, I wouldn't want to move away either. Like, I've got to feed my family. So what are you going to offer me? What are you going to offer me and the people I work with to come on board? And this is really key. Like, we can't leave it to the market because the market is going to destroy these people. It's going to leave them. We've seen this like in northern Germany. We've seen it in the north of England. I mean, during the 80s, what happened to the mining towns? Huge unemployment, huge depression, huge suicide rates. People don't want to go back there. So how can we make sure we actually talk to trade unions in a way that brings them on board and takes their concerns on board? And that's with AOC, with the Green New Deal. It was really about making sure, okay, it's not the strongest thing in the world, but it's building bridges and showing that the trade unions and I'd say the green movement and the social justice movement can be heading in the same direction. So I think these are the things we have to think about. If you want to change something, you want to challenge corporate power, by ourselves we're not powerful. It's when we come together we're powerful. So what are the alliances we need to be making? You need to be thinking, so for this project, who do we need to have on board? Who's going to give us leverage? Yeah, and that's how we fight corporate power. But that's one of the ways. I'm going to go to a few pictures, see if people know what they are. This one here, does anyone know what this is?
Direct action,
Greenpeace, sitting on a box outside BP's headquarters, where they went and they blocked all the entrances to BP's headquarters. And then yesterday, the day before, they got up onto a North Sea oil rig that was about to leave Scotland and go into the North Sea to drill for more oil, and went and stopped it because it couldn't leave. So I was wondering, what are people's thoughts? How legitimate is this? Yeah.
Extremely. It's actually a rational response to what's happening. It's actually totally justified. When you think about the danger we're in, it's totally justified. And I think it just gets headlines, isn't it? That's the thing.
Yeah. And how does it, because I always wonder, how do you think it's perceived by the public as well?
I think at first it's like, oh, who are these crazies? And then when it happens enough, you start thinking, oh, why are so many people doing this? And then you wonder, oh, maybe they have a point,
Yeah. And I was going to ask, so for me, I find Greenpeace interesting, because do you know what they're demanding? So they're demanding that BP pulls out of oil and gas, fossil fuels, and moves to renewables. And they're going to stay there until they do so. But what's interesting for me, if we're fighting corporate power, is they're aiming the demand at a corporation. They're, for me at least, and maybe this is me being a bit extreme, but they're legitimizing this corporate actor, this corporation as an actor in our political system, saying, BP, please change. That they are the actor with the agency. And I don't know, it depends. Do you think should we be aiming? I think it's a very important thing to point out, because Greenpeace's campaigns are very much aimed at a corporation saying you must change. And for me, at least from my side, I don't think they're legitimate actors. I think they're the ones who should be following the rules rather than making the rules. And actually, it's the government who's a legitimate actor, who's supposed to be democratically elected. Of course, it's a bit trickier said than done, but it's interesting. So this is one form of shutting it down, direct action. And then we've got the other one, which came about recently. Do people know what this is? Did anyone go down?
Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah. Was anyone there? Yeah. I was in France. I missed all of it. But what are people's thoughts? As a legitimate tactic, are they confronting corporate power? So probably the complete opposite to Greenpeace. So Greenpeace was going directly to BP saying change. Extinction Rebellion are going directly for the government saying declare a climate emergency, 2025, net zero and sortition. What are people's thoughts about Extinction Rebellion and their acceptability compared to Greenpeace, or?
It's not working. You see all this, but really nothing's changing. Some people might change their minds, but in the long run, it's not doing a lot. So really, it'd be better if you're targeting people locally who you know to start making smaller changes to eventually make a bigger change.
So something where you can really feel the impact. So this is, again, be it alternatives or other things. So that's an interesting thing of people not seeing results can be really frustrating, and not feeling it's working.
I think they have a really good message in the sense that they're trying to focus on creating urgency, and you can see that just with their name. Look at the names of the two organizations, Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion, like when you read the name Extinction Rebellion, you see X many thousand people are part of a movement called Extinction Rebellion. You start thinking, are we going to go extinct soon? Should we be rebelling? Which is kind of it sounds like nothing, but that's huge when it's a headline.
Yeah.
Extinction Rebellion, and they made a big headline in the Guardian yesterday, I think. And they kind of got me into this sort of. I mean, they've done a good job, I think, in my opinion, of changing the dialogue from we should be nice to oh my God, this is happening, do something quick, like this is the last chance we have, which I think is important.
They also make us feel like we all have a role to play as an individual, and we can just get out of our house, go in the street, and actually do something and have an impact without having to go to the cold votes.
Yeah, very true. And I think I was going to say interesting here. So system change, not climate change. Does that mean anything to anyone here? I mean, for me, I've worked in this field for a long time, and it's a slogan I've said many times. But I'm wondering, for people who went along, what does that mean to them? What do they feel when you hear it or say it? And what would you understand by the word system as well?
How everything is interconnected, and also the fact that maybe we can fight one corporation, but the system will stay the same, and maybe the same problems will arise again, even if we shut down one corporation.
Yeah.
But if we change the system for the best, everything is supposed to work better.
Also, the system can be changed. It's not this fixed structure that is locked into something and can't be improved. Like, it can be changed. So it's clearly not working.
Yeah.
So why not change it?
Definitely. And as you said, so it's calling on the government to change that system. But very different, as we heard, like from Greenpeace, who's aiming specifically at one corporation. They're aiming at government. And then I wanted to bring up, does anyone know what this is?
Tar sands?
No, closer. It's in Germany. So this is massive. You can sort of see it back here. This is a coal digger. And this is something called Ende Gelände, where I think I'm somewhere in here. And thousands of people went and occupied a coal mine in Germany. And the main demand was a coal phase out. So it's interesting. So this was Ende Gelände. And it sort of tries to, I guess, combine some of these approaches. But as you say, it's difficult. Not everyone can go and occupy a coal mine. It's also a step up. It's not on your doorstep. So there's different approaches, but all are aiming to shut things down, be it a city, be it infrastructure, be it an office. But there's a big difference. Greenpeace did it with 2 people. Extinction Rebellion did it with a few thousand. This has done it with, there's one happening not this weekend, next weekend, in fact, in Germany again, with thousands of people expected. So, and it's interesting. There's been a coal phase out announced, but only by 2038, which is a huge, huge, huge disappointment, which is why it's still going on. And one of the reasons is the trade unions, because it's not a decent deal to pull out. But anyway, I thought it was worth sort of highlighting these are all different ways to fight corporate power, and depends whether you want to fight single corporations, the government who supposedly is able to, or is in charge of the system, but I think it's much more complicated than that, as we showed earlier, or you go for companies and demand policy changes. Another way is, this is a really bad picture actually, because it doesn't show you at all what it is. So there's actually a campaign for a UN binding treaty on transnational corporations. And it's been put forward by Ecuador, and it's linked to the Business and Human Rights Council in the UN. And it's being opposed by the EU and some others, but actually they're trying to come up with a treaty which means corporations, rather than just having privileges and ISDS and private courts, they're going to have responsibilities, which is what's missing now. So this is trying to address the architecture of impunity, of trying to address how corporations are able to get away with what they do across the world at the moment, and actually hold them to account. I think it's one way to do it. Also, what for me is the important thing with lots of these things is how do you use these to raise awareness? Because these processes will never win by themselves, the same way we said with elections and other things. You win because you've got enough public support, you've got people in the streets behind you. So this process is a really important one, but I don't think it's got enough support to really make sure we get a binding treaty, because the UN is always going to be the sum of its parts. So it's going to be, I really hope it does well, but there's a lot of countries who are blocking. So we really need to try and sort of fight back to make sure something strong comes out. So one way, another way, this is regulating them basically. We can regulate corporations and try and change the system. And I was going to say, this is something, a campaign I've been involved in for the last few years, of we're trying to kick the fossil fuel industry out of the UN climate talks, because they shouldn't be there. This is the companies causing climate change. What are they doing at the table of the climate talks? I mean, it makes sense. The same thing happened to the tobacco industry. So this is actually an approach which can work. The tobacco industry has been kicked out of tobacco policy making by the World Health Organization because they were lobbying, because their lobbies were so effective. They were giving fake science. They were employing ex-politicians. They were getting their people into government, at national level, UN level. And so the UN said, we need to kick them out. And so, in fact, in the new treaty, that came out in the mid-2000s, was to kick out the tobacco lobby from policy making. And not just at the UN level. Every country that signs the tobacco treaty is called the United Nations Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Every country that signs it also has to implement it. So we're seeing the EU has signed it. So the EU has to implement it, not very well. The Netherlands has signed it and is implementing it much better. I think every country but the US and one other signed this treaty. And we're now trying to do the same with the fossil fuel industry. So how do we try and kick them out? Because I think part of this is about, sometimes even the things we demand might not be, that won't be the end goal. There's not going to be, even if they're no longer in our politics, is that the end of them? No, of course not. But what we're also trying to do is undermine their legitimacy. And so this is a really important thing. When we were talking before about the cultural hegemony and about the cultural value of these companies, it's really important to see how much people think they're a legitimate part of our society, and how can we delegitimize them? How can we make them, how can we make them feel that rather than being part of the solution, they're part of the problem? And this is what we've been quite good at. We've not seen the effect yet, but it's been something that's been really powerful, at least for me to see, that we're trying to remove the social license of the fossil fuel industry, which will make it far easier to then deconstruct it and to actually come with positive forward-looking solutions rather than ones which are based on how do we compensate them.
So do you think that's what Greenpeace's tactics were aimed at, rather than sort of, I know there's maybe like slightly larger critique that you discussed, but do you think that's what, in their strategy room, that's what they'd be thinking?
Yeah, so for me, Greenpeace's approach is we're going to pick the market leader, or, it's the UK, so this is the UK's biggest oil company, and it's trying to demonize them. It's trying to make sure that BP, the rest of the industry looks at BP and goes, shit, this could be us next. Is it one of Greenpeace's main aims? And there's a question of, is BP capable of really doing this? Is BP capable of moving towards renewables? But I guess this comes, for me, another big question with Greenpeace's approach. Do I want BP owning all the renewables? No, I don't. I don't want BP involved in my economy, I have to say. I think for this company, I've been watching their lobbying for the last however many years, and what they do is promote solutions that fit their own economic agenda. They promote false solutions such as biofuels, which allow them to sort of carry on with oil because it will just replace oil eventually. Crazy tech solutions to capture the CO2 and bury it rather than moving away from fossil fuels. So this for me is because again it gives them a huge amount of political leverage. If we say, okay, BP, either you pull out of oil, as a ultimatum, pull out of oil or you're no longer going to be in existence. That's pretty strong. But it's saying, no, you're part of our political landscape. You're part of our economy. You should be allowed, still to be there. So I don't feel it does delegitimize it. It delegitimizes their business model rather than them. And I think it's an interesting one because I wouldn't want them owning massive wind farms. I think their shareholder value is the thing that they prioritize most through shareholder buybacks and other things. Even if they did move, I think it'd be great to show that a company could move, but I don't think it's possible either. So I think it's giving them a bit too much power rather than saying this is what you're going to do because we've got the regulations that are going to make you do it, and we'll negotiate other things.
So just a kind of question back to the free trade court process. Does that mean that once a country has agreed, it's like we're sort of, until we get rid of that, we're just locked in forever? Is that kind of what?
Yeah.
Is there any way back?
So at the moment, there's a big treaty called the Energy Charter Treaty at the EU level. It's with, it was mainly to bring Eastern European countries into Western Europe and allow Western European energy companies to invest there and not be afraid in sort of post-communist times. And now they're trying to expand it all over the place. And that is one of the main sources of court cases, is this treaty that not many people have heard of. And once you're in it, I think Italy's currently trying to pull out of it because Italy's facing lots of court cases for saying no to oil drilling or other things. So Italy's trying to pull out of it. It takes a while. Other of these investment treaties, they have what's called zombie clauses. So even if you pull out of it, you'll still have to pay and you still have to be part of this court case system. So it's really difficult, but they're all political. It's amazing. So we can enforce a trade deal. We'll never enforce a climate deal because there's no political will behind it. So for me, I think that, Brazil has never signed one and doesn't want to be part of them. South Africa's trying to pull out of some of them. I think if you change the culture around them, sort of the social context around them, if you change public opinion and popular opinion, and first of all raise awareness that these exist, we will make it much easier to pull out of them. And it will be much harder for corporations to sue countries because it won't be upheld as, well, this is just how the system works. So I think, for me, so many of these laws are underpinned by political belief. But ultimately, the international system is an anarchic system,
Yeah, technically, states are sovereign.
Yeah.
No parliament can bind itself in the future, right? So
No.
you could always pull out.
You could, by paying huge amounts of money. The international system is based on...
There are penalty clauses built into these things. Right?
Yeah, based on adherence to these rules. So pulling out, they've made sure you can't pull out, but some of them you can. It just takes a long time and et cetera, et cetera. So we're trying to. But it's the other, let's see if that's the right slide. Yeah. So the other sort of, for me, the other social license, the effort to erode the social license is the divestment movement. Have people had a divestment movement in the UK? Globally, in fact. So pioneered by a group called 350.org, and they're trying to get pension funds, universities, colleges, councils, rich individuals to divest their money from fossil fuels. So this, on the one hand, deals with, okay, we're going to try and take away their money, quite physically and literally, like getting Norway to pull out of fossil fuels is pretty big. And then number two, we're telling people that by not having your money in the fossil fuel industry, then there's not a good place to be. It's like, how do we demonize and toxify the fossil fuel industry? So this is something they've been doing via the divestment campaign. And for me, I think the social license element, that they're trying to take away the social license by divesting, is as impactful as the actual money side. It's how to, it makes it really difficult if everyone's saying take your money out of the fossil fuel industry, for the fossil fuel industry to then turn around and say, no, we're still calling the shots. It's like it erodes their political power as well. But yeah, as I said, we're, have I got it here? No. We're trying to kick the fossil fuel industry out of politics, not just the UN level. We're now launching a campaign in September to kick them out of Brussels and to kick them out of national capitals. So this is, how do we really toxify them, but also remove their political control? We want to stop the revolving door. We want to stop, foreign policy being dictated by Eni and Shell, these sorts of things. And so for us, it's something that, at least for me, I really feel when I look at Extinction Rebellion and the amazing work they've done in mobilizing people, I really miss a political analysis, because they say governments change things, but they don't talk about how governments have their hands tied, how governments are part of this sort of architecture of impunity, how governments have the oil industry in their board, in their sort of, not in their boards, that's what companies have, in their cabinet offices, in their meetings, etc. How do we really break this to try and make a demand such as Extinction Rebellion or the school strikes, youth strikes for climate, make them a reality? Because otherwise governments just cannot act at the moment. They've not got the power to act. We know this, it's clear. They haven't got the money to be able to act, or the legitimacy at the moment to be able to act, because the fossil fuel industry is too strong. So how can we really flip this? How can we get that industry out of our government? And how can we make sure government feels empowered enough to act? So this is, for me, I think something that's quite an important way to fight against corporate power, is to look at its political influence. So we've got the money, we've got the sort of, the social license, the money, and the political influence, the sort of the legs are identified. I was going to ask, is there any questions? I had a few questions for yourselves. Are there any other ways to tackle gum? Yeah.
I just wondered if you thought there was any parallel between, you mentioned tobacco, but there's certainly other industries or economies that we, decided at some point in our history we're not okay with this. Slavery really springs to mind, and whether it's worth looking at the kind of deal that were put in place to dissolve or placate the interests that were around those industries at that time. Because I know, when Britain banned the slave trade, all the compensation didn't go to the slaves, it went to the slave owners, because they were the ones that were considered to be out of pocket in the whole equation, and it seemed like the only way that they could actually bring the whole thing to an end. And I wonder if you think there's going to be a similar model that we look at. Big tobacco is a pariah in lots of all these policy areas that you're talking about, and they're not listened to anywhere near as much as they were in the 60s, 70s.
Completely.
Yeah, I just wonder if you think there's models that exist.
I think the tobacco one's better. I think it's, the fossil fuel industry is so crucial to our economy. Energy is the lifeblood. So to actually, I think tackling tobacco versus fossil fuels is far harder to tackle fossil fuels, but I think it's a great example because there wasn't the compensation. Like you said, the slavery, the British government only recently finished paying off its debt that it accrued from paying off slave owners. I think a tweet came out from the Treasury last year, something like this, a year or two ago, saying, "Woo, we finally paid off." Yeah. Like they thought this was a good thing to tweet about. Anyway, It was quite scandalous at the time. But this is, I mean, in the system we've got, this is what I see. I think I completely, if we're going to move away from fossil fuels, at the moment, with the power balance, we're going to pay them off for sure. We already are. We're already paying them in certain instances to not drill. So imagine, we're paying them to not do something they're not doing already. It's madness. But yeah, it brings in lots, for me, the questions around quantitative easing and where it goes. Big question. It always comes back to the money. I mean, but to have the confidence to be able to say to the industry, this is what's happening, takes, I mean, it's interesting, at the EU level, there's just not the thinking that's been done on how do we wind down this industry. Like, the EU says by 2050, we're going to have a carbon neutral economy. It's going to be net zero. And all our gas system is going to be decarbonised. And this can mean various things. But up until 2030, gas use stays exactly the same as it is today. So that means between 2030 and 2050, it's magically just going to have to, really, really plummet. From what I hear, there's no plan of how we wind it down because we're still in a market economy. Instead, what they're looking for is how to expand gas markets. I mean, seeing like regulator documents, how do we get gas into transport, or how do we get it into maritime stuff or heating, because we need to make sure this industry, which provides so many jobs, stays alive. So I think there's a huge problem in that we're not, because we've got a market economy, we're not able to talk about how do we wind down certain industries. But yeah, I completely agree, it's going to end up with money. It's going to be compensation. I don't know where the money's going to come from. I mean, there is no money. This is the thing. Is it going to be quantitative easing? We're going to create money out of nothing and give it to the fossil fuel industry?
We have hyperinflation and it would be a financial crisis anyway, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I sort of thought the only way we're going to spend enough money on the green stuff is through quantitative easing anyway. Through creating public investment banks that are specifically aimed at that, green investment banks. But this is a bit of another one. But yeah, how do you move away from that industry? It's really tricky. I mean,
is there an extent to which they could almost be considered nationalisable? Like,
so there was
they're so entwined with.
For the Labour government that said in the UK it's going to be nationalised the energy sector. Utilities have come out and said, you're having a laugh, you don't know what you're talking about. If you try and retake back a contract, you've got to compensate that contract, plus they can probably sue you. The law firms who are helping them have said, we're definitely having a laugh. The law firms have said, we're going to earn lots of money from this. But the question is, we need to change the system where renationalisation is no longer seen as a dirty word, and that the financial costs are not borne by citizens. Yeah.
Do you think that universal basic income has a role in providing people with a basic level of security, which could make them less dependent on their next paycheck, and could help them to get out on the streets and spend more time learning about this? Do you know what I mean? Like, do you see that as is that part of the Green New Deal? I haven't actually read the document.
No,
I need to read it, or no, it's not.
Not the US one. The UK? No. There's quite a few different Green New Deals.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Going around.
Yeah.
It depends. Yeah, that depends. But then the AOC would know. But I think if it was set at the right level, it could be a very good tool. Where would it be paid from? I think you'd have to massively increase corporate taxation to pay for it.
Don't we have the money already? We're just not spending it on poor people. We're spending it on the welfare system, right? I mean,
But the welfare system is supposed to be.
Sorry?
Isn't the welfare system supposed to be for poor people?
No, it is. But if you take, there's a book called Utopia for Realists, and this chap makes an argument that if you took all of the salaries of all of the social workers and all of the bureaucracy around the welfare system, lots of people like investigating people to make sure they're not cheating welfare, and there's counsellors, there's all sorts of different people. If you just took all their salaries and just paid it to people, gave people a basic level of income, that actually it could pay for itself. And he makes an argument in the book that it would actually save the government money if they did it. So I'm not an expert on this stuff, but there are arguments out there on the lines that that's possible.
Definitely, I think getting rid of counsellors and social workers is a really bad idea. in terms of who it holds up. I mean, because it's not just about giving people money, it's not reducing this to an economic equation, it's realizing this is a social issue.
But so you said the law firm said that it's unrealistic, but then if you change the law, couldn't you make it realistic?
Unfortunately, the European law, when we pull out of Brexit, if the UK pulls out of the UK, it would still be under the Energy Charter Treaty, which it's signed up to. So there's still international treaties that we part of, which have this arbitration, which would allow you to take it to the secret courts.
And you could withdraw from the treaty now?
Not easily, no. And it takes, I think, 5 years or something. So it depends. Yeah.
If there's so many, you can see there's a lot of people that want this. I know no one likes paying taxes, but could you not just introduce a new tax, like a new personal tax, a green tax, say, and you know that it's going to the right place, all of it does get used for the right projects. If everyone does want this, could you not introduce a new tax for it?
Definitely. There's lots of possibilities out there in terms of how to raise the money. You have a progressive tax. Be careful because, for example, Macron in France introduced a flat tax on petrol that backfired massively. I mean, it's a stupid thing to do after giving millionaires loads of tax cuts. Hit poorest, well, poorest and middle class is hardest, and you came out with the yellow vests movement, which turned into much bigger than being anti-petrol tax, for sure. But what we see is often these taxes are put down and they don't take account that some people have less money than others. What the Greens are pushing for, I think it's the UK Green Party, is a frequent flyers tax as well. So you don't pay much tax on your first flight or second flight or whatever, and then the more flights you take, the higher up it goes, which hits frequent flyers. There's many taxes you can introduce that are progressive, that could work really well. And ultimately the tax needs to be levied against industries for polluting as well. There's a lot of money out there.
The carbon tax dividend, I heard.
The carbon tax dividend, which is introduced in the UK as basically a carbon floor tax, because the emissions trading scheme wasn't producing the revenues it was supposed to, because it's full of loopholes, because there's been massive lobbies around it. Instead, it was giving money directly to big polluters. You should read about it; it's pretty depressing. So the UK introduced a carbon floor price, and that could be much higher. It could be at €60 or £60 or whatever it is. It's not going to be because the political will. So there's lots of options, but the question that comes back is always political will. And so whilst governments don't feel pressure, and B, are not being blackmailed by companies saying we're going to leave. I mean, because around carbon floor tax, for example, big polluting industries are going to leave. Like the cement industry has mainly gone to North Africa, and then still exports the cement to Europe, but all the emissions are now in North Africa. I mean, it's what happened to a lot of industries have sort of always called offshored and gone to Southeast Asia and other places, mainly to reduce wages. It's one of the bonuses of globalization. You can choose your cheapest wages. But yeah, I think we need to be careful to make sure, we protect jobs and do these things. But there's lots of different options. But I was going to ask, done this bit. Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask your views for the last few minutes. Do you feel it's interesting? Because what I do is I try and expose lobbying, but in Brussels there's a lot of NGO lobbying as well. And I was wondering how effective people feel here in the UK or in your own countries or anything. How effective do you feel like green NGO lobbying has been? Like from Greenpeace, from others. I think Greenpeace's thing ultimately is about lobbying as well.
In lobbying governments?
Yeah, government.
As far as I can see, it's not effective at all, but perhaps I'm wrong. I mean, I suppose it goes wrong behind closed doors, but can't see any change, really, to be honest. Some token efforts here and there, but nothing big enough. I don't know.
I mean, I was just going to say, because I think it has a role to play. I think it can be effective if the goalposts, let's say, I mean, if we have a social democratic government, so a Labour Party or someone in power, you can probably do quite cool things by lobbying. If you have a conservative government in power, the margins is just very different, where you can sort of convince them to go a little bit this way or a little bit this way, but you're not going to get them to be over here. And so I think there's, for me, I've found a lot of NGOs through the 90s and 2000s have very much moved towards lobbying because they had access to Labour governments across Europe. And it's meant there's been a sort of a lack of connection with grassroots groups. And they're now regretting this massively because they've not been able to influence anything. But just, I was going to say, when I was working on the gas industry, we saw that in terms of resources, and this is why I don't think lobbying can ever be that effective, in terms of resources, the gas industry had more than 100 million euros to spend on lobbying, and civil society had, I think, 3.4 million in total. So you had a 30-to-1 ratio. In terms of personnel, the gas lobby had over 1,000 lobbyists focused on Brussels, and civil society had 100. So you've got 10-to-1 in terms of like numbers as well, and this has played out. There's a huge structural inequality. So if we want to fight corporate power, I think we have to do it through movements, through organising people, getting public pressure together, people on the streets, etc. Rather than, I think we have to be very aware of where our strength is, and it's about those personal connections, be it going to the smaller scale and getting people to believe, and then how do you scale this up, rather than trying to professionalise it and target government. I'm not saying the targeting government doesn't work. It works when there's movements behind it.
Yeah, I think the potential now maybe for having some influence is increased with the rise of green parties in Europe, and maybe not so much in the UK because there was a whole Brexit issue, so it's a bit different. But I mean, if you look at Germany, they had like 20%, they came second, close second. And so now that they're getting into positions of power, I think there's more potential to influence from that front.
Just taking into account what you just said, where sort of thinking about almost strategically where do you put your resources. If all the sort of NGO lobbyists pulled out though of say Brussels, and you ended up with 0 to 1,000 lobbyists, would that have would it be even worse?
I think it's so. What we're very good at doing is stopping bad shit happening, stopping shit getting worse. Basically, green NGOs. Be it the UN talks, be it in Brussels, be it in London. And so I think it's like for pulling out, I think we have to be very aware of what role they play there. They can be positive, but are they legitimizing an entire system whereby their role is very much reduced and they're saying this is okay, this is just how it works? Or are they actually trying to change that system? For example, trying to kick the fossil industry out, which will fundamentally change the rules of the game. Because if they just carry on playing the rules of the game behind closed doors most of the time, then they will get small, they will definitely make it less worse. And I think that's a really valid thing, but they also legitimize a system that ultimately will be holding back other people trying to go further. So the question is, how much further can they go? And this is always this tension between they want to be listened to by policymakers, which means having to have a position quite close to the policymakers, versus doing what's needed, what's demanded. Which is why it's interesting. Extinction Rebellion came up, and the first action they did, they occupied Greenpeace's office. They said, "You're not doing enough."
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit stupid thing to do when they share the same sport they are. It's just it feels very inside-y.
Internalizing.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah.
So they're just testing their occupation tactics.
Yeah.
On a friendly ground.
Yeah. I mean, but in terms of the green parties, I think having more green parties in power is potentially a good thing. It depends what they do. I mean, we saw the Green Party in Germany took part in a coalition with Merkel's government, Merkel's the SPD, and introduced austerity, and it destroyed them. So like the Liberal Democrats got into power with the Tories, wiped them out. I mean, I'm not a Liberal Democrat fan anyway, but the Green Party has to be really careful. What's it mean to be in power? And I've said at the European level, European elections are always very different to national elections. But I hope the Green Party has learned its lessons, that it needs to be a red-green party rather than just a green party. Otherwise, what we're seeing instead is this division in Europe. So Western Europe has gone a bit more green. Not one green party. There's not apart from I think Portugal, Southern and Eastern Europe, not one green party MEP was elected. So which shows this huge split. So I think it's something to be very wary of when we talk about the Greens. What does the Green Party represent, and who does that speak to? Green Party in the European Parliament. I think the work they do in the UK is great, but are they talking to the working classes? Is this, who's the power base that it's going to mobilise? Is it just going to be Extinction Rebellion folk, or are we going to get beyond that? You're going to talk to trade unions and others. Yeah, I was going to, okay, let's stop there. I was going to, oh yeah, also attack, no, I don't have it here. This is my, so attack their narrative. If we're talking about the American dream, etc., I think it's really important to highlight what they stand for and to try and show people about these contradictions. I'm talking rubbish. Let me just quickly, I'm going to send you, I'm going to put on a short video for the last 15-20 minutes.
My name is Anna Galkina, and I work for a platform in London, and I'm also part of the Switched on London campaign.
I'm David Boyes. I'm Deputy General Secretary with Public Services International, which is the global trade union federation representing 20 million workers in 150 countries.
My name is Dinga Sikwebu. I'm from the National Union of Metal Workers in South Africa, NUMSA.
So I work for Platform London, based in London. My name is Mika Minia, and we've been focused on, well, initially the oil and gas industry since the mid-90s, and increasing also on energy as a whole on a wider basis.
My name's Nick Dearden. I'm from Global Justice Now. Well, energy is the lifeblood of the global economy. It's a very valuable commodity, but it's also something that should be a human right. And if we simply run it for profit, it's very difficult to use it to meet people's needs. And then you add into that equation the fact that the way we're producing energy is trashing the planet and destroying our environment. So if you take all those things together, it's pretty clear we need a massive transformation. If we're going to meet people's needs, protect our planet, we need to actually take it out of the hands of those who are simply trying to run it to make more money.
Energy, oil and gas particularly, but also energy wider, is a central part of the economy and shapes ultimately the social relations and material conditions and democratic possibilities in Britain, in Nigeria, in Egypt, in Alberta, in Canada. And we need to be challenging the role both of companies and of states in asserting control in repressive ways, in ways that close down possibilities for communities to organize, and also to ultimately build a better world and a different society.
Could you run a hospital without energy? No, you can't. If you don't have the energy to pump the water through the purifying plant and then pump it to the houses, you won't have water. If you don't have energy to light your streets, they're unsafe. If you don't have energy to power your trams and your buses, you don't have public transport. So it's clear for all of our sectors, energy is key. Energy is key. But it's also key to our overall approach of building just and equitable societies. Given that more than 50% of humanity lives in cities, our cities are powered by electricity and other forms of energy. So it runs through everything we say, and it's the underpinning, it's one of the foundation stones of building just and equitable societies.
So for me, energy democracy is a system whereby energy is used primarily for people's needs. So you don't run it like we run it now, with the poorest people in our society paying proportionally the highest price, and of course our planet paying the highest price of all. Rather, you give priority to the needs of everybody. Everybody has the right to a certain amount of energy. You make it as renewable as possible, ultimately 100% renewable. And I think the only way you can really guarantee that is to give people control, is to make it accountable, transparent, and actually democratic, to really put it into the hands of ordinary people. And where that's been tried through cooperatives or through innovative public systems, it's proved a really positive, transformative way of running our energy system in the world.
Energy democracy is a concept in evolution. It's a concept that looks to get beyond this corporate, whether public or private, massive corporate financial conglomerate that is really driving the whole global economy. So it's looking not just at specific ways to have democratic control of energy, but it's looking at changing from the neoliberal market-driven way of organizing society, whether it's consumption, whether it's production, whether it's social relations, inequality. So again, because energy is one of the foundation stones of modern equitable society, the way it's organized also has to be equitable.
So we see energy democracy, particularly working in London, as a crucial part of of moving away from fossil fuels and of the climate transition. Partly what it offers is it offers a political recognition that switching from oil to renewables is not politics free. It's not value free. And that actually the switch, as fossil fuels very much have a central part in our political system, but also we need to shift to an energy system which is ultimately around freedom, around justice, around meeting people's social needs and allowing communities to be empowered and not crushed. And energy democracy allows us to bring politics in to debate around what an energy transition should look like.
That doesn't mean we can't do anything. That doesn't mean, we should just go back to bed because it's too difficult, because people are actually right the way around the world, from London, where we're campaigning to set up a public energy company which will be democratically controlled by Londoners so that we can have a fairer, more renewable energy system in London, right the way around the world to Latin American countries, South Africa, India, where people are struggling to set up co-ops and so on that give people who don't even have any energy energy that is both fairly allocated and also not harming the planet.
I mean, energy is a big issue for workers and ordinary people because energy is a key input into production. Secondly, energy shapes the lives of ordinary people in a big way. Without energy, there can be no production. Without energy, people cannot live ordinary and meaningful lives. So energy is a key input in shaping what people can do, how they live, and a lack of energy is a form of inequality. And in South Africa, where you've had a system of inequality, this extended to also access to energy. Historically, in South Africa, energy was produced to power mines, to power the sort of the big industries. And for many people, they didn't have access to energy.
It's not an issue just for the energy unions. And this is what we've seen with the trade unions for energy democracy. We're bringing in health unions. We're bringing in unions that deal with the janitors, the cleaners of real estate. We're bringing in different sectors because the issue of energy cuts across all of our society and underpins it. So the energy unions need to feel not threatened, but they need to feel that together, collectively, and with social movements, that we will create the political dynamic to protect them during the transition. That for us is fundamental.
Look, I mean, for ordinary people, the question of access to energy services is critical. For ordinary people, the question of affordable energy is critical. The question of energy that is sustainable is critical, because for people, what's the point of having energy today and when you won't have it tomorrow?
Traditionally, there was an idea that all you needed to do was elect the right government and let them get on with the running energy in the public interest. And I think people over the last 40 years have become much more distrustful of the state because they see the way that the state has colluded. Various governments of various shades have colluded with big business to take power out of our hands and to run our societies as commodities for profit. And therefore, we need to approach this with much more skepticism of the state. But that doesn't mean the state has no role. In fact, we absolutely need to use collective political power through the state in order to enable people to be able to provide on a scale that we need to provide energy. But people can't let go. People can't just say, okay, we'll leave, we've taken it so far, we'll leave it to you now. They need to remain in the struggle. I think co-ops therefore have a really important role to play as a way that people can come together collectively and say, no matter what the state does, we're going to try and do this ourselves. But ultimately, we see that we do need the power of the state in order to make this work across our society as a whole. So it's going to be a complex process of people engaging in politics and engaging in the political process, but at the same time, retaining a distance from that process.
So Switched on London is a campaign for a democratically accountable, sustainable, and justice-aware public power company for London. And it came about as a result of the kind of political shift that we see going on in the UK, where there's suddenly a new left emerging with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party. And there is a big movement for communities taking back their power in terms of people organising energy cooperatives, but these are quite small local initiatives. We wanted to push something really big and really ambitious. The other kind of origin of it is that there are tens of thousands of people in the UK living in fuel poverty, and actually thousands of people dying every year from cold homes. And the tariffs that people pay for their energy are extremely unfair. They actually penalise those people who pay, who use the least energy. And we wanted to explore municipal energy as a way of addressing that systemic issue, both by reversing the tariffs so that the tariffs help out those people who are in fuel poverty, and also by helping people insulate their homes, helping people keep their homes warm, because the housing stock is so depleted and so old and falling apart in England.
Well, in Europe today, we're seeing something pretty interesting. For a long time, political parties have not interested a lot of activists because they feel very isolated from parties who, when they get into government, do exactly the same thing or nearly the same thing as the last government. We're now seeing a wave of anger in Europe as a result of the austerity that we've been forced to bear for the crimes of the banks and the elite. And as a result of that, people have started forming new sorts of parties. And we hope there'll be more democratic forms of parties, but Podemos and Syriza and the Left Bloc in Portugal, but also in Britain now, we have a new leadership of the Labour Party, which is much more in favour of things like energy democracy. And I think what we need to do is that, but there's a vacuum. These parties have a vacuum of thought around things like energy, because we've had a dominant economic paradigm for such a long time now, neoliberalism. So we want to help fill that vacuum. We want to make sure those parties, by working together, can actually come up with a way of running society which is both more fair and equal, but also less centralized, less dependent on the big state doing everything for us. But I don't see that there's a better time to do that than now, when so many people are disaffected with the institutions that run our society in the interest of a very few.
So we see public municipal energy as something, as a way of addressing the challenges of scale in energy democracy. So there's a lot of optimism for communities trying to take back their own power through small renewable installations, but that's tiny, and the challenge of decarbonising, the challenge of providing renewable energy is huge. So we see municipal energy as something that can bridge that gap between the really massive challenge and the kind of small-scale, decentralised responses. And we see London as one of the places that could implement that. And we're really inspired by what's going on in Germany with cities taking back their power, and we hope that we can improve on that.
One challenge that we face is how do we, when we're pushing for progressive, let's say, moving finance, and we're pushing a public pension fund to take money out of fossil fuels, great, well done them, and then we're pushing to put it somewhere else. And it's easy to say, put it in the low carbon transition, but that could be lost next. So how do we get them to then put it into something which is actually public and democratic? Because the easy things to put it into are not. Like, you can put it into a housing project which is low carbon, but actually it's probably gentrifying. Or you can put it into an energy cooperative, but maybe that energy cooperative is ultimately mostly quite well-off middle-class people, and it isn't redistributive. The challenge of how do we move finance and money, public money, out of fossil fuels and into something else that probably will be less profitable and also works in terms of energy solidarity on a global scale and doesn't replicate colonialism and expropriation. How do we do that?
Yeah, so we've been, in the past involved in trying to stop water being privatized and run as a public good. And what that took was campaign organizations, NGOs, people of faith and trade unions, particularly working together to achieve that. And it also required a degree of international solidarity. I think energy is even more of a challenge than water because energy is so central to the way that the global economy works and global capitalism works. So therefore, it's going to mean even more organizations working together. But I think, at the end of the day, we have a very